3 years later, I still wake up hearing Sarah's screams. Not the first ones. Those were too human. It's the final screams that haunt me, when her voice was no longer her own, when her eyes melted in their sockets as they studied how the human nervous system processes pain. There were 5 of us that night in the Appalachians. Me, my twin sister Rachel, her husband Tom, Sarah, a neurosurgery resident, and Mike, a physics professor. 5 people who should have never climbed those mountains. 5 lives that ended in ways the human mind should never be able to comprehend. The E. Terror began at sunset. Tom's GPS showed the first anomalies. Impossible coordinates, numbers that changed every second. The air grew heavy, as if the very atmosphere was being compressed by something gigantic and invisible. Mike tried to rationalize it, using his instruments to measure gravitational variations. The devices exploded in his hands, leaving burns, shaped like symbols that pulsed beneath his skin. At 3:33 they came, not with lights in the sky or strange sounds. They simply appeared. 7 feet tall, gray pale skin stretched over bodies too thin to be natural. Their eyes, no, those black holes on their faces weren't eyes. They were windows into a void that shouldn't exist. Mike was the first. His body levitated off the ground like a broken puppet. I saw his eyes widen in realization, that exact moment when his scientific mind understood that there are truths in the universe that should never be uncovered. They opened his skull with precise touches of long, thin fingers. There was no blood, only a silvery liquid that dripped from his exposed brain as they reorganized his thoughts. Sarah tried to help him. Her medical training betrayed her. They were fascinated by her anatomical knowledge. They kept her conscious while they studied how the human body processes pain. They opened her chest like a macabre flower, each cut precise and calculated to maximize suffering. Her screams started human, but ended as something else. Something I still hear in the walls of my room at night. Tom tried to protect Rachel. That was his mistake. They wanted to understand human love, so they made him watch. They kept his eyes open while they transformed my sister into something that defied all laws of nature. Her joints were reversed, her organs repositioned, her consciousness fragmented and reassembled like a diabolical puzzle. And throughout the process, they forced him to observe, studying how love turns into absolute horror. Rachel. My twin. Our connection became a curse in that moment. Every alteration they made to her reverberated through me. I felt it when they tore out her tongue to study how humans form words. I felt it when they replaced her eyes with alien crystals that forced her to see realities the human brain wasn't made to process. I felt it when her sanity shattered, piece by piece. Tom's screams stopped when they finally understood the concept of human love. They didn't kill him. They did something far worse. They surgically removed every affectionate memory, every tender moment, studying how the absence of love affects human behavior. What was left of him was just a shell, begging them to kill Rachel to make the love stop hurting. Sarah was still alive when they began removing her nerve endings one by one. Her medical knowledge made her perfectly aware of every procedure. They made her narrate her own vivisections, recording her clinical observations as they tested the limits of human pain resistance. Her voice remained clinical and professional until the end, even when they began replacing her organs with crystalline versions that pulsed with a sickly light. Mike was the last to lose his humanity. His brilliant mind kept him conscious far beyond what should have been possible. He kept trying to theorize, to understand, even when they removed half of his brain to study how human knowledge is stored. His last words were equations, desperate formulas trying to explain the inexplicable. Why? Did they leave me alive? Not out of mercy. They don't know that concept. They kept me as a witness, a living record of their experiments. But they made a mistake. They didn't fully sever my connection with Rachel. Sometimes on the darkest nights I can feel where she is now, somewhere among the stars, in an experimental chamber that defies geometry, still conscious, still screaming, still being studied. Her bodies were found 3 days later, scattered across the forest within a 10-kilometer radius. What remained of them defied medical understanding. Mike's brain had been replaced by a crystal that still pulsed with electrical activity. Sarah's organs were perfectly preserved in an alien substance, still performing their functions, even though they were separated from her body. Tom was found hugging a tree, his body fused with the wood, his eyes still open and aware, silently begging for a death that would never come. Rachel was never found, not completely. Parts of her show up from time to time, a finger here, a patch of skin there, always perfectly preserved, always showing signs of neural activity. As if each fragment of her is still conscious, still feeling, still being studied. The authorities tried to cover it up, of course. They talked about serial killers, satanic rituals, mass murders. But how do you explain the recordings? Mike's equipment captured everything. 3 hours of pure horror that drove 2 FBI agents to commit suicide after watching it. The tape is now locked away in some deep government archive, marked only as Appalachian incident, ultra-classified. The doctors say I'm insane, that the trauma created hallucinations, that the alien-shaped scars on my body are self-inflicted, that the voices I hear at night, the voices of my friends screaming in frequencies that shouldn't exist, are just manifestations of survivors' guilt, but they don't know. They can't know. They don't feel the changes happening inside me. The connection with Rachel still exists, stronger now. Every night, through her, I learn more about our visitors, about their true purpose, about what they're really doing to humanity. These aren't just experiments. It's a cataloging, an archiving of species, and we're just the latest samples in their infinite collection. Every person who disappears in the mountains is another specimen for their living museum of horrors. And the worst part? They're coming back. Not just for more samples, they're coming back to finish what they started with me. I can feel it. Through the remaining fragments of my connection with Rachel, she shows me what they're planning. What they'll do not just to me, but to all of humanity. So if you're planning a trip to the Appalachians, I beg you, stay away from the mountains. If you hear a strange hum in the darkness, if you see tall, thin shapes moving between the trees, if you feel that pressure in the air that makes your bones ache, run. Run before it's too late, because they never stop. They're never satisfied. And once they choose you as a specimen, there's nowhere to run, no way to escape. There's only the eternal horror of being studied, dissected, transformed forever. I can still hear the sound of Helen's bones breaking beneath her own skin. It wasn't a quick, merciful snap. It was a rising symphony of fractures, each one designed to keep her conscious, while her skeleton was reconfigured into patterns that violated nature itself. 3 years have passed, and that sound still echoes in my mind, along with her pleas for someone to kill her before they finished their studies. There were 5 of us that night in the Appalachians. Me, my twin sister Rachel, her husband, Tom, Helen, a neurosurgery resident, and Mark, a physics professor. The expedition was supposed to last just a weekend. Now part of me is still in that clearing, trapped in an eternal nightmare, reliving every moment I watched humanity being dissected and destroyed before my eyes. The first sign came when the stars began to tremble, not just their usual twinkle. It was like someone was tearing small holes in the fabric of the night sky. Mark was the first to notice. His instruments recorded gravitational anomalies that caused the equipment to melt, fusing with his flesh. The smell of burned skin was quickly replaced by something worse, the odor of reality being distorted. At 3:33, the air froze. Not from the cold, it was like time itself had been paused. That's when they emerged, not from ships or portals, but from angles that shouldn't exist in our world. Their shapes were vaguely humanoid, but wrong in ways that made your brain scream in protest. Pale grey skin stretched over bone structures that shifted beneath it, eyes like voids that didn't just suck in light, but your sanity too when you looked at them. Mark, ever the scientist, tried to communicate. That was his first mistake. They responded by removing his tongue, not with tools but with precise touches of fingers that felt like living needles. They kept him conscious while studying how the human brain processes terror. They opened his skull like a macabre flower, each petal of bone and flesh revealing new horrors. His brilliant mind tried to rationalize until the end, even as they began removing portions of his brain, testing which memories persisted, which functions survived. Helen tried to help him. Her medical knowledge made her the perfect specimen. They wanted to understand how a human comprehends their own anatomy, so they forced her to narrate her own vivisection. Her voice remained clinical even as they removed her organs one by one, replacing them with crystalline versions that pulsed with a sickly light. Heart removal process initiated, she reported, tears of terror streaming down her face as she watched her own heart being extracted. Cardiac function? Still maintained through... Oh God, I can see it beating. I can feel it beating outside my body. Tom tried to protect Rachel. Their love sparked a particular interest in these beings. They wanted to understand the concept of human emotional connection, so they devised a disturbing experiment. They kept Tom conscious while systematically removing every part of him that loved my sister. Not just memories, they discovered how to isolate and extract emotions themselves, transforming them into a physical substance that pulsed with a dark light. Please, Tom begged as they worked, don't make me stop loving her. But they continued methodically until his love turned into horror, until every glance at Rachel made him scream in agony beyond the physical. The man who had promised to protect her now writhed in terror at the sight of her face. Rachel. My twin. Our connection became a refined instrument of torture. They discovered how to use our bond to amplify the pain, creating a feedback loop of agony that reverberated between us. Every incision, every alteration was calculated to maximize our shared suffering. They removed her eyes first, replacing them with crystalline orbs that forced her to see realities the human brain was never meant to process. Through our connection, I saw what she saw, dimensions folded upon themselves, fragmented realities where horror was the only constant. Her mouth was the worst. They didn't remove it, they turned it into something else, an opening that defied the laws of anatomy, a portal through which they inserted impossible instruments. I could feel every alien probe exploring not just her body, but her very essence. They were mapping the human soul, discovering how to deconstruct it into its most basic components. I don't know how long it lasted. Time lost all meaning in that clearing. It could have been hours or years. I saw Mark transformed into a pulsating mass of exposed neural tissue, still trying to formulate theories about what was happening to him. I saw Helen clinically catalogue her own organ removals until her voice became something that shouldn't exist. I saw Tom scream in horror at the mere thought of the love he once felt. Why did they leave me alive? Not out of mercy, they don't comprehend that concept. They left me as a witness, but they made a crucial mistake. The connection with Rachel remained. Not entirely, but enough for me to feel what they continue to do to her. She's somewhere beyond the stars now, in an experimental chamber that defies human understanding. Every night, I feel when they open her up again, when they test new procedures, when they discover new ways to turn pain into data. The others' bodies were found scattered throughout the forest. What remained of them defied all medical logic. Mark was fused to his own instruments, his exposed brain still processing impossible equations. Helen's organs were perfectly preserved in crystalline containers, still functioning, still being studied. Tom was found embracing a tree, his body partially merged with the wood, his eyes still conscious, still silently begging for a death that would never come. The authorities tried to cover it up, of course. They spoke of serial killers, of satanic rituals, but the evidence was impossible to explain. The footage Mark's equipment recorded drove 2 FBI agents insane. The tape is now locked away in some deep government archive, along with Helen's crystalline organs that still pulse with life, still performing their functions even after 3 years. The doctors say I've developed schizophrenia, that the marks on my body are self-inflicted. They can't explain why my scars glow under ultraviolet light, forming symbols that cause computers to crash when trying to process them. They don't understand why my DNA is gradually rewriting itself, why my tests show organs that shouldn't exist. Through Rachel, I learn more each night. These aren't just experiments, it's a systematic cataloging of the human species. Every person who disappears in the mountains is another specimen in their endless archive of horror. And now, Now I know they're coming back, not just for more specimens. They're coming back to finish what they started. So if you're planning to visit the Appalachians, I beg you, stay away. If you hear a hum that makes your teeth ache, if you see shapes your eyes refuse to process, if you feel that pressure in the air that makes your reality tremble, run, because they never stop. They're never satisfied. And when they choose you as a specimen, there's no escape. Only the eternal horror of being studied, dissected, and transformed, forever conscious, forever screaming, forever being discovered anew. The sound of the gunshot still echoes in my nightmares. It's not just the noise, it's everything that came after. The dull thud of David's body hitting the damp earth, the sick grin on that man's face as he held my husband's gun, the moment my normal life ended and my nightmare began. We had planned that camping trip for months. David always wanted to explore the Appalachians, to see the less touristy spots. When we saw that man stumbling along the trail, thin and disoriented, our first instinct was to help. That was David, always wanting to do the right thing. He insisted on sharing our food, our shelter. He was the one who invited the stranger to join us until we reached the next town. The man introduced himself as John. He looked like he was in his early 30s, though it was hard to tell because of his unkempt beard and his eyes. Those eyes. That seemed far too old, carrying something deeply unsettling in their depths. While he ate our food, he told disjointed stories about surviving in the mountains. David was fascinated. All I could feel was a growing sense of dread. The gunshot came out of nowhere. One moment we were sitting around the campfire. The next, David was on the ground, his glassy eyes reflecting the flames, a red hole in his forehead. John was holding the gun he had taken from David's backpack when he went to gather more firewood. "Now you're my wife," he said with terrifying calm. His voice had changed. It wasn't the voice of a lost, starving man anymore. It was something primal, animalistic. "He wasn't good enough for you. I saw how he treated you, all that affection, making you weak. I'll make you strong." What followed was a forced march up the mountain. John knew the trails like he was born there. Every time I stumbled, he punished me. Not with physical violence. He had crueler methods. He made me look at David's body, which he dragged along with us as a reminder. He forced me to thank him for every new bruise, for every moment of terror. The food ran out on the third day. John seemed pleased about it. "Now you'll learn," he said, watching me search for roots and berries, just like I did. His obsession with making me strong took increasingly disturbing forms. He made me sleep beside David's decomposing body, whispering in my ear how I should be grateful to have a real husband now. His stories became more disturbing with each passing night. He talked about other wives he'd had in the mountains, about how they all failed to become strong. He described in morbid detail what had happened to each of them. "But you're different," he'd say, stroking my face with hands that smelled of death. "You'll survive. You'll learn to love the mountains like I do." The terror wasn't just in the physical abuse, it was in how he twisted reality. He made me repeat that I was his wife until my own voice sounded strange to me. He forced me to thank him for every new horror, every humiliation. "This is how true love works in the mountains," he explained, while forcing me to eat insects. "First we break, then we get stronger." The cabin appeared after a week, a rustic structure inhabited by an elderly couple. John changed instantly. He reverted to the lost, hungry man we had first encountered. He introduced me as his wife, his fingers leaving purple marks on my arm as he smiled. "I found her in the mountains," he told the couple. "She's a gift from them." The elderly couple sensed something was wrong. The woman, Martha, saw the terror in my eyes when John forced me to kiss him. The man, Bill, noticed the marks on my wrists, the tremor in my hands. They gave me a separate room, saying it wasn't proper for us to sleep together before the official wedding. That night I managed to tell Martha everything. John was asleep, drugged by the food Bill had generously offered him. Authorities arrived the next morning. David's body was found where John had hidden it, covered in leaves and dirt. John's true story emerged during the investigation. His real name was Timothy Brooks, a child who had disappeared in the Appalachians 20 years earlier. He had survived alone in the mountains, gradually going insane, developing a sick obsession with creating a family. I wasn't his. First victim, remains of other couples were found in the areas he had indicated. He escaped from prison 3 months later. The search lasted a week until they found his body in the same spot where he had killed David. He had left a note, written in his own blood. "The mountains are my only wife." 5 years later, I still wake up screaming every night. I relive the moment of the shot, see John smile, smell the death that emanated from him. The therapists say it's PTSD, that it will eventually pass. But they don't understand. It's not just the trauma, it's the fear that part of me stayed in those mountains. The part that after days of terror and manipulation started to believe his words. Sometimes in my darkest nightmares, it's not John who pulls the trigger. It's me. And the worst part? In some of those dreams, I'm smiling. Smiling just like he did. The police say it's all over, that I can move on. But I know the truth. Those mountains changed something fundamental in me, just like they changed that lost boy 20 years ago. And on the darkest nights, when I wake up drenched in sweat, I wonder if one day I'll want to go back. If the mountains are just waiting patiently for their next victim. As I battle the demons that still haunt my dreams, I realize that the true horror doesn't reside solely in Timothy's hands, but in the very essence of the Appalachians. Every rock and tree seems to carry the memory of screams and whispers, as if past horrors have fused with the present, injecting a silent poison into my soul. Nature, once a symbol of freedom, now reflects a distorted mirror of my own suffering, revealing a fear that consumes me with every step on the trail. In the midst of this darkness, I feel torn between the desperate desire to forget and the strange, pulled to revisit the paths where the horror blossomed. The memory of John's smile and the perversity of his actions intertwine with my anguish, making me question if a part of me somehow desires a reconciliation with that dark past. Every time I walk among the trees, it's as if the earth itself whispers macabre secrets, trying to pull me into an abyss from which I fear I may never escape. Yet I've learned that healing rarely comes without scars. Today I carry those marks not just as reminders of violence, but as signs of a strength that, though shaken, still persists within me. With each sunrise, I fight to rebuild the person I was before the nightmare, transforming the pain into a quiet resilience. Even though Timothy's shadow and the echo of the mountains still linger over my mind, I find in small moments of clarity the hope that one day I can turn the terror I lived through into a lesson about the fragility and tenacity of the human spirit. Are you brave enough to venture into the mountains after these stories? If these accounts gave you chills, subscribe to our channel, give us a like, and share this video with friends who can handle a scare. Don't forget to hit the bell so you won't miss any new disturbing stories. And now we want to hear from you. Which of the 3 stories shocked you the most? Have you ever had a creepy experience yourself, or do you know someone who has encountered something unexplainable? Tell us in the comments. Maybe your story will be the next one we share in a video, if you dare.